As per the last episode, I now have a functional router table, but it's missing the most important accessory, and that is the fence. I'm going to use some red gum for the fence, and I happen to have some pieces that were used as wheel chocks for trucks and other random purposes. So it's quite dry, and also they're not exactly straight. So that means it's time to go back to the thicknesser and make it a square piece of wood. The fence needs to be 3 inches wider on each side of the table, so that makes it roughly 37¼ inches, and this beam is about 40 inches, so hopefully we'll get a good solid usable piece from the red gum. As you can see from the wood, there are some nice cracks and holes in the wood, so I won't know how much usable wood we'll get until I mill it down square. Talking about square, I tried using the jig I previously created for my table saw to cut one square edge. However, this jig has warped a bit over time and isn't as flat as it originally was. Once again, I'm reaching limits of my saw blade height, so this time I decided to try a different jig using the thicknesser. This involves sandwiching my newly milled parallel faces between some square lengths that are screwed into a piece of MDF. This causes the piece to be 90 degrees square to the new faces, and it should stay in this orientation due to the guides holding it firmly in place. This is also laid out on an angle on the MDF as it prevents me from blunting one spot on the thicknesser blades. This way the cuts are spread across the width of the blades. Once this is done, I use a table saw to cut the other edge square, and now I have a piece of lumber ready to cut into a fence. Now the guide I'm following wants me to make a T-track into the wood of the fence. However, I've decided to use a piece of aluminium T-track instead, as I can see me just damaging the wood track over time. So this top section of the fence would require me to make 2 pieces and then glue them together. The bottom section of the fence has 2 faces that slide outwards to create an opening for the router bit depending on the size of the bit being used. This also requires me to make 2 pieces with some slots cut in them and then glue them together. I would then glue these top and bottom sections together and I end up with a fence. Because I'm using the aluminium T-track, the top section only needs to be a solid piece. However, I'll also combine the upper half of the bottom section as part of this piece, make the slot cuts and then glue the bottom piece on. This should result in essentially the same size fence. I've made the required calculations about the specific size and shape of the upper piece, and as you can see from my sketch, it has an upper lip where the T-track will be mounted to. Now that I have the red gum cut roughly to size, I use the thicknesser and my vernier calipers to mill the wood down to the exact thickness it needs to be. I find this more accurate than the table saw, and while it is a slower process, I want this fence to be as accurate as possible. Once I've got it down to size, you can see there are some imperfections in the wood still. However, I've worked out that these will be mostly removed in the next steps where I cut the lip for the T-track to sit on. Talking of the T-track, I use it here to mark where the cuts need to be made and of course mark the waste areas with an X. I spent a bit of time on the table saw and some scrap wood aligning the fence to the exact width and depth of the cut before committing to removing that waste. Even when I thought I had it all correct, I stopped and looked at what I was doing, and I realised I'd set up the blade to cut from the wrong side. That old saying, measure twice, cut once, really hit home here. So anyways, I redid the saw blade to the correct width and depth of cut and was ready to go. Once I made this first cut, I lined up the T-track against it and it was perfect. So, on to adjusting the blade for the second cut to remove the remaining waste. Once again testing the cut with some scrap first before moving on to the real piece. Don't worry, I was extremely conscious of where my hands were placed during this cut. I don't want to be losing any fingers. With the T-track sitting on top, you can see the fence is starting to come together, and I'm very happy with the progress so far. The blade depth in that last cut was about 0.5 millimeter too short, so there's this little edge I'll need to chisel back. I didn't want to risk another pass on the table saw to screw it up at this stage. Now that the fence is the shape I want, it's time to cut it down to size. I start off at this end, taping it with some blue painter's tape. This end is where there is a small split, so hopefully once this is cut, the end will be nice and solid, which it is. I then measure out the exact length for the other end and repeat the same steps to bring it down to the exact size. Next up is to cut 4 dados that the threaded knobs will be mounted through. These will be connected to the front face pieces, allowing them to slide open and close for the different size router bits. I take the time to mark all 4 and also clearly mark the waist sections with an X so I know exactly where I'm cutting. After setting the depth of the blade to 3/8 of an inch, I do a couple of test cuts to make sure the depth is correct. With this all set up, I put some blue painter's tape on the back side of the fence and proceed to cut the dados. I have a method I follow when cutting dados like this. I cut one end first, then move to the other end of the dado and work my way back towards the first cut. I find doing it this way I won't overcut as it's obvious when I've reached the end. Before too long it's all done and I'm left with a nice pile of red sawdust. After a quick cleanup, I remove the blue tape and it's looking awesome. A quick test with the 5/16 bolt and it's perfect. Yes, I know the bolt is short, but I'll be custom making my own lengths with threaded rod later on. I give the dados a quick sand now to remove any obvious imperfections, but you won't actually see these inside holes, so that's all the sanding I'll be doing here. Okay, so now it's time to make the faces and the bottom piece of the fence. This means it's time to go back to the thicknesser and mill another length of red gum to see if I can get more usable timber out of this piece. The bottom of the fence will have a 4-inch gap in the middle, so I can get away with 2 separate lengths, and seeing as the face is also 2 separate pieces, all I need here is 4 usable lengths that are just over half the length of the fence. Milling is a time-consuming process, so let's skip ahead and see how it turned out. I'll be honest, I wasn't overly impressed with the result as there were still quite a few holes and cracks. However, I'm gambling that once I start cutting into it, I'll get some nice pieces on the inside. After doing some calculations, I determined the best way to cut this piece within the limitations of my saw blade height. Here you can see that once cut open, there are some bad sections of wood that will not be usable, but onwards I say. I ended up picking the 4 best pieces and cutting them down to a shorter length, and then running them through the thicknesser. After each pass, checking the thickness with my vernier calipers, and then adjusting the cut slightly to repeat the process until I had the pieces at 3/4 of an inch thick, or 19.05 millimeters. Before proceeding any further, I mark out the 4-inch gap that will be located in the center of the fence. This is where the router bit will be, and the front faces can be adjusted to suit the bit being used. I'm marking this out now as I'll be gluing the bottom pieces, and this will allow me to determine where they will need to go. Like I mentioned earlier, the second beam of red gum I milled wasn't as good as I had hoped, so I'm making sure I get the best bits of the pieces I milled. Next up, I need to cut the 2 base pieces down to the correct width, which is 1 3/4 of an inch. Once again, I use a test piece to ensure I've correctly set the table saw fence before committing to making the cut. I'm really liking the push stick I recently created. It feels much safer to use the table saw, and it was pretty easy to make. Before you know it, I've got the pieces cut to size and it's time to glue them to the base of the fence. Now, before I glue them down, the guide I'm following tells me to dry clamp them first and screw them down so that when I actually glue them, they will not slide around, which is something I experienced when gluing the leg pieces. So with that knowledge, I set up some clamps to hold the base pieces between some bits of scrap to keep them parallel to the fence. With it clamped in place, I proceed to drill 2 pilot holes for the screws and countersink the holes for the screws. I repeat the whole process on the other side, and here you can see how the fence is taking shape. The outer edges will need to be trimmed. I'll be doing this once they've been glued together. I'm not ready to glue these pieces yet because I need to mark out where these slots will be located on my face pieces, and it'll be easier to do this before they are glued. It's time for a little demonstration of how this will work. This is a jig kit of 5/16 threaded rods, knobs, inserts and nuts. Here you can see how the faces will slide apart from each other, and when I turn it on the side you can see how the threaded rod passes through. This will screw into inserts that will be located on the face. Once I've trimmed the rod down to size, I'll fix a threaded knob to the end of it, and this will allow me to tighten the face in place as required. Okay, so demonstration over. Take some time here working out where I will be positioning each face, and I also am able to determine exactly how wide it needs to be, which is 2.5 inches. Once again, I cut a test piece to ensure I'm making an accurate cut, and then 2 passes later I have my fence pieces at the correct width. My guide is telling me that I need to bevel the insides of the fences to 45 degrees, so back to the table saw, and to be honest, I've never used the blade in this position. I used the miter gauge that came with the table saw, and before you know it, the pieces are cut perfectly. One last step is to square off the edge of the bevel, so I use my miter sled to do this, and we're done. 2 nicely cut faces. After completing that step, it's time to make the slot holes on the faces. I have the fence and faces clamped up against the edge of my miter sled in their correct position, so now I can unscrew the bottom pieces from the fence, exposing the dado slots against the fence pieces. This makes it super easy to mark out these locations, as this is where the inserts will be located on the faces. With the clamp removed, you can get a better visualization as to how this will all work with the threaded rod coming through and connecting to the insert on the face piece. So after all this planning, I can now go ahead and glue the bottom pieces to the base of the fence. This is very easy, seeing as I've got the screws to keep the pieces located in place, but I take my time and make sure everything lines up as it should. Today's episode took part over a rainy Saturday and Sunday, and I spent about 14 hours to get to this stage. I really wanted to reach this milestone, and I'm happy I did. There's still a few steps to go before the fence is finished, but I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. It can be a relief to reach the end stages of a project after so long. Let me know in the comments what feelings you experience. Until next time, bye!